Pasta served on metal trays by American guards to bewildered Italian prisoners. Wine poured in measured portions during Sunday meals. Men in tattered military uniforms with Italian insignia standing in cafeteria lines, unable to comprehend the paradox of their captivity. This was not the harsh imprisonment they had feared when surrendering in North Africa. This was America's secret weapon in World War II, humanitarianism as psychological warfare. Before we dive into this extraordinary story, tell me in the comments, which city are you watching from? It's incredible to see our historical community spread across the world. And if you're new here, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Each subscription helps us continue unearthing these fascinating stories that shaped our world. Now, let's get to the story. The North African campaign of 1942-1943 yielded an unexpected bounty for the United States. Over 50,000 Italian prisoners of war, men who had been fighting under Mussolini's fascist banner, now destined for captivity in a foreign land thousands of miles from home. What unfolded next became one of the most remarkable and overlooked chapters of World War II, a story of cultural accommodation, unexpected freedoms, and a humanitarian approach to warfare that challenged every convention of how enemy combatants should be treated. May 1943, the scorching Tunisian sun beat down on the dejected columns of Italian soldiers marching into Allied captivity. Operation Husky, the Allied invasion of Sicily, was still 2 months away, but the Axis position in North Africa had already collapsed. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel's famed Afrika Korps and their Italian allies had been outmaneuvered, outgunned, and ultimately defeated by the combined Allied forces under General Eisenhower's command. Among the hundreds of thousands of Axis troops surrendering to the Allies were tens of thousands of Italian soldiers, men from Naples, Sicily, Rome, Tuscany, and every corner of Italy, now facing an uncertain future as prisoners of war. Lieutenant Marco Bresciani, a 27-year-old artillery officer from Florence, stood in line as American military police processed the endless columns of prisoners. "They gave us water and cigarettes," he would later write in his diary. The Americans seemed almost embarrassed by our condition. We had been told they would treat us like animals, but their first act was one of kindness. This initial encounter would set the tone for what was to come, a captivity experience unlike anything these Italian soldiers could have imagined. The logistical challenge facing the American military was immense. The number of Italian prisoners captured in North Africa had far exceeded expectations. Temporary holding facilities in North Africa were quickly overwhelmed. With the campaign for Sicily and mainland Italy still ahead, military planners made a pivotal decision. These prisoners would be transported across the Atlantic to camps in the continental United States. The sea journey itself was harrowing. Converted Liberty ships, designed for cargo rather than human transport, were hastily adapted to carry hundreds of prisoners across submarine-infested waters. The men were packed into cramped quarters below deck, many suffering from seasickness throughout the 2-week crossing. Private Giuseppe Manzoni from Milan recalled, "We were told America was sending these ships to Africa filled with weapons and supplies for their troops. Now they were returning with human cargo, us. I wondered what awaited us in this distant land we knew only from cinema and propaganda. What awaited them would challenge everything they had been told about America." As their ships docked in ports from Norfolk to New York, Boston to Newport News, the Italian prisoners caught their first glimpses of the United States, a nation untouched by bombing, with cities whose lights remained on at night, with civilians who appeared well-fed and well-dressed despite 3 years of war. "It was as if we had arrived on another planet," wrote Sergeant Paolo Vitelli in a letter he would only be able to send after the war. The abundance was shocking to us who had grown accustomed to rationing and shortages. From these ports, the prisoners were loaded onto trains with windows that weren't blacked out, another shock to men who had lived under wartime conditions in Europe. The trains carried them across the American landscape to camps scattered across 46 states, from Maine to California, Florida to Washington. The U.S. War Department had established a vast network of prisoner-of-war camps, many built on existing military bases or as purpose-built facilities in rural areas where the prisoners could be put to work addressing labor shortages in agriculture and industry. Camp Hereford in the Texas Panhandle, Fort Patrick Henry in Virginia, Camp Florence in Arizona, Camp Gordon Johnston in Florida, Camp Monticello in Arkansas. These names would become deeply familiar to thousands of Italian men who never expected to see the American heartland. Each camp was constructed according to the specifications laid out in the Geneva Convention with standard barracks, medical facilities, recreational areas, and mess halls. The consistency of the physical structures masked the remarkable diversity of experiences that would unfold within them. The Italian prisoners arrived with trepidation, their minds filled with fascist propaganda about American brutality and the supposed inferior status of Italians in American society. What they found instead was a system that would fundamentally challenge their worldview. From the beginning, American authorities made a strategic decision regarding Italian POWs. They would be treated not merely according to the minimum standards required by the Geneva Convention, but with a level of accommodation that reflected the complex position of Italy in the Axis alliance. Colonel John Corbley, who supervised several POW camps, explained the rationale in a declassified memo from July 1943. The Italian prisoner presents a unique opportunity. Unlike the German POWs, many Italians have family connections in America. Their commitment to fascism is often superficial. With proper treatment, we believe they can be persuaded to reconsider their allegiance, perhaps even to cooperate with us as the war progresses. This assessment proved prescient. When Italy surrendered to the Allies on September 8, 1943, the status of Italian POWs became even more complex. Technically, Italy was no longer an enemy nation but a co-belligerent against Germany. This created an unprecedented situation. Thousands of prisoners of war whose home country was now fighting alongside their captors. The American authorities responded with a bold experiment, the Italian Service Units, ISU program. Under this program, Italian POWs who swore an oath of cooperation with the Allied war effort were granted remarkable privileges while still remaining technically prisoners of war. They would work not just on farms and in food processing plants, but in military installations, hospitals, and other facilities directly supporting the American war effort. They would receive payment for their work, freedom of movement within defined boundaries, and cultural accommodations that recognized their Italian identity. It was this last aspect, the cultural accommodation, that created the scenes that would seem so incongruous to outside observers. Italian prisoners being served pasta, wine, and other familiar foods from their homeland, while American GIs in the Pacific survived on K-rations. The reasoning was both pragmatic and psychological. Well-fed, culturally respected prisoners were less likely to attempt escape, more likely to work productively, and more likely to develop positive feelings toward their captors. Lieutenant Colonel George Carlin, a camp commander in Texas, defended the practice in a report to his superiors. The provision of occasional Italian-style meals, including modest wine rations on Sundays, has dramatically improved morale and productivity. The cost is negligible compared to the benefits. We find the Italian prisoners work harder and create fewer disciplinary problems when we make these small accommodations to their culture. The cultural accommodations extended beyond food. Camp administrators encouraged the formation of choirs that performed traditional Italian songs, art classes where prisoners created paintings and sculptures, and even theater groups that performed plays in Italian. Religious observances were respected, with Catholic priests either brought in from nearby communities or selected from among ordained prisoners to conduct services. In Camp Hereford, Texas, prisoner Gaetano Falcone established a camp newspaper called L'Echo, the Echo, that ran for 2 years, featuring poetry, short stories, news from Italy, carefully curated by American authorities, and announcements about camp activities. In Fort Missoula, Montana, prisoners constructed a bocce court where tournaments were held every Sunday after Mass. At Camp Florence in Arizona, The prisoners built a chapel with elaborate decorations crafted from available materials, a structure so beautiful that locals were permitted to visit it on special occasions. These cultural activities served multiple purposes. They kept the prisoners occupied, reducing disciplinary problems. They allowed for the expression of Italian identity in ways that didn't conflict with security concerns. And perhaps most importantly, they created a subtle psychological distinction between the Italian and German prisoners in the minds of both the captives and their guards. While German POWs were held to strict military discipline, Italian prisoners were increasingly treated as unfortunate conscripts who had been dragged into a war not of their choosing. This distinction became explicit after Italy's surrender and the establishment of the Italian service. Units. Prisoners who joined these units wore special uniforms with Italy, patches that distinguished them from both standard prisoners. And from American military personnel, they were granted passes to visit nearby towns on weekends, could receive and send mail more frequently, and were paid for their work at rates comparable to American soldiers in equivalent positions. Not all Italian prisoners chose to join the ISUs. Some remained loyal to Mussolini and his newly established puppet state in northern Italy. The Italian Social Republic, Repubblica Sociale Italiana, or RSI. These non-cooperators, as they were labeled by American authorities, remained in more traditional POW settings with fewer privileges. The split created tensions within the Italian prisoner community, reflecting the civil war that was simultaneously unfolding in their homeland between fascist loyalists and partisans supporting the new Italian government allied with the Americans. Captain Enzo Raffaelli, a committed fascist officer held at Camp Gordon Johnston in Florida, described the division in his secret diary. The traitors eat their American pasta and drink their American wine, wearing their special uniforms with Italy written on them as if they represent our true nation. They have abandoned Il Duce for a few privileges. History will judge them harshly. His words reflected a minority view among the prisoners, but one that created significant management challenges for camp administrators trying to maintain order. The work assignments given to Italian POWs, both those in regular status and those in the ISUs, reflected America's wartime labor shortages. With millions of American men in uniform and deployed overseas, essential industries faced critical workforce deficits. Agricultural production was particularly vulnerable as the mechanization of farming was still in its early stages, and much harvesting was done by hand. Italian prisoners found themselves picking cotton in Texas, harvesting sugar beets in Colorado, working in canneries in California, and picking citrus fruits in Florida. Domenico Veronese, a former tailor from Milan captured in Tunisia, found himself harvesting tomatoes in central California. In a letter permitted by censors to reach his family, he wrote, "The irony does not escape me that I am picking tomatoes that will likely become the sauce for the pasta they sometimes serve us. The fields here are vast beyond imagination, nothing like our small plots in Italy. One farm here is bigger than many villages at home." The experience of agricultural work resonated differently with prisoners from different backgrounds. Those from rural areas, particularly southern Italy, often found familiar comfort in the rhythms of farming, even if the scale and methods were different. Urban prisoners, however, struggled with the physical demands and unfamiliar nature of agricultural labor. Camp administrators tried when possible to match prisoners' civilian skills with appropriate work, placing former mechanics in motor pools, former cooks in kitchens, and those with medical training in camp hospitals. Beyond agriculture, Italian prisoners worked in food processing plants, lumber mills, and even in military hospitals, where they served as orderlies and support staff. At the Moore General Hospital in Swannanoa, North Carolina, Italian POWs from the 4th ISU Company cared for American wounded returning from Europe, sometimes from the very battlefields where the Italians had surrendered. These encounters created complex emotional dynamics on both sides. Some American soldiers resented being cared for by former enemies. Others formed genuine bonds with their Italian attendants. Private First Class Raymond Doyle recovering from wounds received in the Italian campaign, described his initial reaction to Italian orderlies in a letter home. "At first I was furious that they'd put these guys in charge of our care. But Giovanni, the one who helps me with physical therapy, lost his brother to American bombs in Naples. Yet, here he is, gentle as can be, helping me regain the use of my legs. We've both lost people we love in this damned war. Sometimes I think he understands my pain better than anyone else could." Food became the most visible and remembered aspect of the Italian POW experience in America. The standard rations allocated for prisoners under the Geneva Convention were already generous by the standards of war-torn Europe. But for Italian prisoners, American camp commanders made adaptations that recognized the cultural importance of food in Italian identity. Army procurement officers were instructed to source ingredients that could be used to prepare Italian-style meals: pasta, olive oil, tomatoes, and even wine for Sunday dinners. The wine ration became particularly legendary, both among the prisoners themselves and in the memories of Americans who lived near the camps. The Geneva Convention permitted alcoholic beverages for prisoners if they were part of their customary diet. American authorities interpreted this provision liberally for Italian POWs, allowing a measured ration of wine, typically half a cup, with Sunday meals. This practice, while completely in line with Italian cultural norms, created some controversy in American communities, particularly in dry counties where the sale of alcohol was prohibited for local citizens. Mrs. Eleanor Simmons, who lived near Camp Gordon Johnston in Florida, expressed her frustration in a letter to her congressman. "My son is fighting in the Pacific, eating jungle rations while these Italian prisoners drink wine on Sundays. They live better than many Americans during this time of rationing. How is this proper?" Her sentiment was echoed by others who observed the seemingly generous treatment of enemy prisoners. Military authorities defended the practice as both humane and strategic. Major William Richards, a camp administrator in California, responded to similar complaints in a local newspaper. The wine ration for Italian prisoners costs less than other morale-building activities. A content prisoner is a productive prisoner who causes fewer disciplinary problems. Every bushel of vegetables they harvest helps feed our troops overseas. Their labor is a vital contribution to our war effort. For the prisoners themselves, these cultural accommodations created a profound psychological impact. Many had expected harsh treatment based on fascist propaganda about Americans. The provision of familiar foods and respect for Italian traditions created cognitive dissonance that helped undermine their previous political indoctrination. As one prisoner, Antonio Cervi, wrote in his memoirs after the war, "We had been told Americans would treat us like animals. Instead, they treated us like humans with a culture worth respecting. It made everything the fascists had told us suspect." The story of Italian POWs in America is also the story of unexpected cultural exchanges and lasting influences. In communities across America, the presence of Italian prisoners introduced authentic Italian cooking, music, art, and customs to regions that had little previous exposure to Italian culture. In return, the prisoners absorbed American practices, English language, and perspectives that many would carry back to post-war Italy. In Hereford, Texas, local resident Martha Collins recalled, "Before the camp, most folks around here thought Italian food was just spaghetti with ketchup. The prisoners taught the camp cooks real Italian recipes, and those cooks taught their families. By the time the Italians left, you could find olive oil in our local grocery store for the first time ever." These cultural exchanges multiplied across the country, leaving subtle but lasting impressions on American culinary practices in regions far from traditional Italian-American communities. For the prisoners, exposure to American agricultural techniques, industrial practices, and social customs provided knowledge that would prove valuable in post-war Italy. Aldo Piccinini, who worked on a mechanized farm in Kansas, later became an advocate for agricultural modernization in his home region of Emilia-Romagna. In his application for American farming equipment under the Marshall Plan, he specifically cited his experiences as a POW. "I have seen how machinery can transform production. What took 50 men in Italy could be done by 5 men and the right equipment in Kansas, the relationships between Italian prisoners and the American communities near their camps defied all expectations of wartime dynamics. Unlike German POWs, who generally maintained greater distance from local populations, Italian prisoners often formed warm connections with American civilians. These relationships were facilitated by several factors: the Italian-American population in the United States, which created cultural bridges, the cooperative status of many Italians after Italy's surrender, and the less ideologically driven nature of many Italian soldiers compared to their German counterparts. In communities with significant Italian-American populations, extraordinary connections sometimes formed. At Fort Wadsworth in New York, prisoner Salvatore Lodato discovered that his uncle, who had emigrated to America 20 years earlier, lived just miles from the camp. After a complex approval process involving military intelligence officers, the uncle was permitted to visit his nephew under supervision. Similar stories unfolded across the country, creating surreal situations where family reunions took place in the context of wartime captivity. Even in regions without significant Italian-American communities, local civilians often developed sympathetic relationships with the Italian prisoners. In Missoula, Montana, the POWs were permitted to create an orchestra that performed concerts attended by local residents. In Ogden, Utah, prisoners with artistic talents were commissioned to paint murals in local churches. In Conway, Arkansas, Italian stonemasons helped build a rock wall around Hendrix College that still stands today. These interactions were not without controversy. Military authorities maintained rules restricting fraternization, particularly with female civilians. However, these rules proved increasingly difficult to enforce, especially for prisoners in the ISUs who had greater freedom of movement. Romantic relationships inevitably developed, despite regulations prohibiting them. Camp commanders found themselves in the awkward position of trying to balance security concerns with the reality that Italy was now technically an allied nation, making the prisoners something between enemies and friends. The American government's experiment with Italian prisoners reflected a sophisticated understanding of psychological warfare and cultural diplomacy. By treating Italian POWs with dignity and cultural respect, American authorities created powerful contrasts to fascist propaganda. Every letter home describing decent treatment, every returning prisoner with positive experiences to share, undermined the fascist narrative about American hostility toward Italians. Lieutenant Colonel Edward Davison, who helped shape POW policy in the War Department, articulated this approach in a confidential 1944 memo. "Our treatment of prisoners is not merely a matter of fulfilling Geneva Convention obligations. It is psychological warfare. Every well-treated prisoner becomes a potential ambassador for American values upon repatriation. The Italian prisoners, particularly, represent an opportunity to influence post-war Italy's orientation toward democracy." This calculated humanitarianism reflected America's emerging understanding of soft power in international relations. While the term wouldn't be coined until decades later, the principle was clearly operating in POW policy. By demonstrating American abundance, fairness, and cultural respect, authorities hoped to win influence that would extend beyond the war years and into the critical period of post-war reconstruction. As 1944 progressed and Allied forces pushed deeper into Europe, the role of Italian service units grew increasingly important to the American war effort. With more American men deployed overseas, the labor of Italian prisoners became essential to maintaining agricultural production and supporting military operations on the home front. At Camp Florence in Arizona, the local newspaper reported that Italian prisoners saved the critical cotton harvest when labor shortages reached crisis levels. In Maryland, Italian POWs processed tomatoes that would become K-rations for American troops. At military hospitals across the country, they cared for wounded GIs returning from battle. This contribution created a strange paradox. Men who had begun the war as enemy combatants were now materially supporting the American war effort against their former German allies. The psychological impact of this role reversal was profound. Many Italian prisoners developed genuine investment in Allied victory, particularly as news filtered through about German atrocities in occupied Italy following the Italian surrender. One such prisoner was Dr. Gaetano Rossi, a physician captured in Tunisia who worked in the hospital at Fort George G. Meade in Maryland. In his journal, he recorded his evolving perspective. "Today, I treated an American soldier wounded at Anzio. The Germans holding that line are killing my countrymen and defending the puppet regime of Mussolini. How strange that my enemy 6 months ago is now the defender of my homeland, while my former ally is its oppressor. In saving this American's life, I feel I am somehow helping to liberate Italy." This sentiment was common among Italian prisoners, particularly as news of partisan resistance against Germans and fascists in northern Italy reached them through approved newspapers and radio broadcasts. Many began to see their work in America as an indirect contribution to Italy's liberation, a perspective American authorities actively encouraged. The experiences of Italian POWs in the United States varied dramatically depending on their location. Those held in the Southwest and Deep South encountered climates somewhat familiar to Mediterranean natives, but also experienced America's racial segregation system that contradicted democratic ideals. Those in the northern states faced harsh winters, unlike anything in their homeland, but found themselves in communities often more accustomed to European immigrants. Winter posed particular challenges for prisoners from southern Italy, unaccustomed to sub-zero temperatures and heavy snow. At Camp Gruber in Oklahoma, prisoner Enrico Salvatore described his first American winter. "The cold cuts through everything. We were issued heavy coats, but they seem inadequate against this wind that comes straight from the Arctic. The Americans laugh at our complaints. For them, this is apparently mild weather. I cannot imagine how anyone lives in such conditions." By contrast, Italian prisoners in Florida and Southern California found climates reminiscent of home. At Camp Blanding in Florida, Giuseppe Mantini wrote, "The humidity reminds me of Naples in summer. The fruit trees are different, but the quality of sunlight feels familiar. If I close my eyes, I could almost believe I'm somewhere on the Italian coast. Until I open them and see the strange vegetation and flat landscape stretching forever. These vastly different environments created diverse experiences that collectively formed the Italian POW story in America. Not one single narrative, but thousands of individual experiences across a continental nation. What united these experiences was the unexpected level of decent treatment and cultural respect that contradicted everything the prisoners had been led to expect about captivity. As Allied forces liberated more of Italy throughout 1944, the status of Italian prisoners became increasingly anomalous. Italy was now a co-belligerent against Germany, with Italian troops fighting alongside Allied forces. Yet tens of thousands of Italian soldiers remained prisoners of war in the United States. The solution emerged gradually. While full repatriation would wait until after the war ended, Italian prisoners were granted increasing privileges and responsibilities, blurring the line between captivity and civilian life. By late 1944, many Italian service unit members were permitted weekend passes to visit nearby cities, attend commercial movies, and even dine in restaurants that agreed to serve them. They wore civilian clothes during these excursions, with only small identifying patches indicating their technical status as prisoners. In some locations, they were allowed to attend church services alongside American civilians, creating surreal Sunday scenes where enemy prisoners worshipped next to families with sons fighting overseas. The question that haunted many prisoners as 1944 came to a close was what would await them upon eventual return to Italy. Their country was being liberated, village by village, city by city, in a brutal campaign that destroyed much of its infrastructure. News of food shortages and civilian suffering reached them through approved channels. Many began to realize that they were experiencing greater material comfort in American captivity than their families were in liberated Italy. This recognition created complex emotions: guilt at their relative comfort, anxiety about the future, and increasing appreciation for the American system that provided this paradoxical situation. As Corporal Bruno Messina wrote in a letter passed by censors, "The great irony of my war is that I have never eaten so well or lived in such comfort as I do now in the hands of those I was sent to fight. Meanwhile, my family writes of going hungry in liberated Naples. What strange twists war creates in human lives." As Christmas 1944 approached, another layer of cultural accommodation appeared in camps across America. Camp commanders authorized special holiday meals incorporating Italian traditions, religious services with Italian Christmas hymns, and permission for prisoners to craft gifts for exchange. At Camp Hereford in Texas, prisoners constructed an elaborate nativity scene that local civilians were invited to view. At Fort Devens in Massachusetts, the Italian prisoners' choir performed a Christmas concert attended by both military personnel and selected civilians from nearby communities. These Christmas observations highlighted the increasingly ambiguous status of Italian prisoners, neither fully enemy nor fully ally, occupying a unique position that would have been unimaginable when they surrendered in the North African desert. As they prepared for a second Christmas in American captivity, most had no idea that the war in Europe had less than 5 months remaining, or that their strange American interlude would soon be drawing to a close. Yet even as Italy and America fought on the same side against Nazi Germany, tens of thousands of Italian soldiers remained behind barbed wire on American soil, their status a complex legal and diplomatic paradox. The prisoners who had witnessed American abundance, who had been treated with unexpected humanity, who had eaten pasta and drunk wine in the middle of America, these men would soon return to a devastated Italy, carrying with them memories and impressions that would influence the post-war relationship between the two countries in ways neither government had fully anticipated. As 1945 dawned and Allied forces pushed toward final victory in Europe, the Italian prisoners in America found themselves looking toward an uncertain future. The world they would return to was not the fascist Italy they had left, but a nation struggling to rebuild from the ashes of war and looking westward for economic and political models. Little did they know that their experiences in American captivity, the unexpected taste of pasta and wine in the heart of America, would become part of the foundation for one of the most successful post-war relationships between former enemies in modern history. The final months of the war brought increasing uncertainty to the Italian prisoners. By early 1945, with Allied victory increasingly certain, they began to contemplate their return to an Italy transformed by conflict. News reaching the camps painted a grim picture: cities bombed beyond recognition, infrastructure destroyed, food shortages, and political turmoil as the country emerged from fascism. Many prisoners realized they had experienced better living conditions in American captivity than awaited them at home. The American authorities, recognizing these concerns, implemented programs to prepare prisoners for repatriation. English language classes were expanded, with instructors emphasizing vocabulary that might help returning prisoners find work with Allied occupation forces. Vocational training programs taught skills in mechanics, construction, and other trades needed for reconstruction. Some camps even offered lectures on democracy and civic governance, a subtle form of political re-education aimed at preparing prisoners to participate in Italy's democratic future. At Camp Clark in Missouri, prisoner Alfredo Bertoni attended these classes religiously. "I was a farmer before the war," he wrote to his brother, "but Italy will need builders now. The Americans are teaching me to work with electrical systems. Perhaps I can help restore power to our village when I return." This practical approach to preparing prisoners for constructive roles in post-war Italy reflected American strategic interests in ensuring a stable, democratic, and Western-oriented Italy after the conflict. The relationship between Italian prisoners and their American guards evolved significantly over time. Initial wariness had given way to familiarity, and in many cases, genuine respect. Captain Robert Wilson, who commanded a company of guards at Camp Florence in Arizona, reflected on this evolution in his post-war memoir. When the Italians first arrived, we viewed them simply as the enemy. 2 years later, I knew their stories, their families, their dreams for after the war. Many guards exchanged addresses with prisoners they had come to respect. The lines between captors and captives had blurred in ways none of us expected. This blurring of lines created challenges for maintaining discipline. As victory in Europe approached, some prisoners grew restless, eager to return home and concerned about their families. Minor disciplinary infractions increased in some camps, while in others prisoners doubled down on work efforts, hoping to earn good reports that might accelerate their repatriation. News of President Roosevelt's death on April 12, 1945, created a poignant moment in many POW camps. Italian prisoners who had come to view Roosevelt as a symbol of American power and leadership participated in memorial observances alongside their guards. At Camp Hereford, the prisoners requested permission to create a memorial plaque, which they crafted from available materials. The inscription, in both Italian and English, read, "To the memory of President Roosevelt, who even in the treatment of his enemies demonstrated the meaning of American democracy." When Germany surrendered on May 8, 1945, the news was met with complex emotions in the Italian camps. Victory in Europe meant that repatriation was now a certainty, but the timing remained unclear. Some prisoners celebrated alongside Americans, particularly those who had family in northern Italy that had been under German occupation. Others remained more reserved, uncertain about the reception that awaited collaborators with the Americans back in Italy. Luigi Bartoli, held at Fort Patrick Henry in Virginia, recorded the moment in his journal, "The Americans are celebrating wildly tonight. For them, it is simple. Their side has won. Their boys will come home. For us, it is more complicated. Yes, Italy is free from German occupation, but we return to a divided country where some will see us as traitors for working with the Americans, while others will condemn us for having fought for Mussolini in the first place. Victory offers us no simple joy." The end of the European conflict created new administrative challenges for American authorities managing the POW system. The Geneva Convention required the repatriation of prisoners as soon as possible after the conclusion of peace, but the logistics were daunting. Shipping capacity was limited, with priority given to returning American servicemen from Europe. Japan's continued resistance meant that the global conflict was not yet over, and the question of whether Italy, a co-belligerent rather than a full Allied power, would receive priority for the return of its nationals remained unresolved. Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Adair, who oversaw prisoner repatriation planning, outlined these challenges in a June 1945 memo. "We have approximately 51,000 Italian prisoners currently in the United States. Their repatriation must be balanced against shipping needs for our own troops, supplies for occupation forces, and relief materials for civilian populations. Current estimates suggest the repatriation process may extend well into 1946. This timeline created a dilemma for the War Department. Maintaining the POW system was expensive, but the prisoners' labor remained valuable, particularly in agriculture. The solution emerged as a compromise. Prisoners would be repatriated in phases, with priority given to those who had refused to cooperate with the Italian service units, those with urgent family situations, and those with medical needs. The remainder would continue working in the United States until shipping became available or their labor was no longer required. For many prisoners, this meant a strange limbo period, still in captivity months after the war in Europe had ended. During this time, regulations were further relaxed. In some camps, prisoners were permitted to accept weekend employment with local farmers or businesses, earning wages that they could save for their eventual return. Cultural activities expanded, with some prisoner groups permitted to give public performances in nearby communities. At Camp Atlanta in Nebraska, the Italian Prisoner Orchestra performed a concert in the local high school auditorium in July 1945, an event attended by hundreds of local residents. The program included both Italian compositions and American favorites, concluding with The Star-Spangled Banner. Sergeant Mario Fusco, who conducted the orchestra, told the local newspaper, "We wish to show our gratitude for the treatment we have received here. Music speaks a universal language that needs no translation." As summer turned to fall in 1945, the first major groups of Italian prisoners began departing for home. The selection process created both anticipation and anxiety. Those chosen for early return faced the prospect of reuniting with families not seen for years, but also of navigating the challenges of post-war Italy. Those required to remain felt the frustration of delayed homecoming, even as their conditions of captivity increasingly resembled normal civilian life. The repatriation process itself created final, sometimes emotional encounters between prisoners and the Americans they had come to know. Guards accompanied prisoners to departure ports, where they boarded the same Liberty ships that had brought them to America, now converted back to troop transports for the return journey. Many exchanges of addresses and promises to write took place on these docks, though Cold War realities would make such correspondence difficult in the years ahead. Captain James Miller, who supervised the departure of prisoners from Camp Wheeler in Georgia, described these moments. "I was surprised by my own emotions watching them leave. Many of these men had worked under my supervision for over 2 years. I had watched them receive letters announcing births, deaths, bombing of their hometowns. I had seen their artwork, heard their music, tasted food they prepared. They were no longer abstract enemies, but men with faces, names, and stories." One prisoner, Antonio, pressed a small carved wooden box into my hands as he boarded the truck. "For your daughter," he said. Remember, not all memories of war must be ugly. For the returning prisoners, the voyage home was filled with uncertainty. Lieutenant Vittorio Palermo, departing from Newport News, Virginia, in September 1945, captured this sentiment in his diary. "We sail toward an Italy none of us truly knows anymore. Letters tell of food shortages, political confusion, destroyed cities. The Americans tell us to be patient, that Marshall Plan aid will rebuild Europe. But patience is difficult when your family writes of hunger. Still, I return with knowledge I did not have before, of American farming methods, of English language, of a society with abundance I never imagined possible. Perhaps this knowledge will be worth something in the new Italy." As Italian prisoners returned home throughout late 1945 and 1946, they carried with them more than personal belongings. They brought experiences of America that would influence their perspectives on politics, economics, and international relations during a critical period in Italian history. As Italy navigated the challenges of post-war reconstruction and determined its place in the emerging Cold War order, the voices of former POWs who had seen America firsthand became part of the national conversation. These former prisoners returned to an Italy struggling to rebuild. Physical destruction was widespread, with major cities like Naples, Milan, and Turin severely damaged by bombing. Economic hardship was universal, with inflation rampant and basic necessities in short supply. Political uncertainty loomed as Italy prepared for its first truly democratic elections, scheduled for June 1946, which would determine whether the country would remain a monarchy or become a republic. In this context, the experiences of returning POWs created stark contrasts. Many found themselves in the surreal position of having been better fed in enemy captivity than their families were in liberated Italy. They returned with stories of American abundance, efficiency, and organizational capacity that seemed almost fantastical to those who had remained in Italy throughout the war. Former prisoner Domenico Marini, who had worked on farms in California, described his family's reaction to his stories. "They thought I was exaggerating when I described the size of American farms, the machinery, the productivity. My father accused me of inventing tales until an American agricultural advisor visited our region and confirmed everything I had described. Then suddenly my experience became valuable. Farmers began asking me about American techniques, as if I had returned with precious knowledge rather than the shame of capture. This pattern repeated across Italy, as returning prisoners found that their Americans' experience had provided them with unexpected advantages. Those who had learned English had employment opportunities with Allied occupation authorities, and later with American businesses establishing European operations. Those who had acquired technical skills found roles in reconstruction projects. Those who had worked in American agriculture brought back knowledge of techniques and technologies that would influence Italian farming practices. Former artillery officer Pietro Lombardi, who had worked in a vehicle maintenance facility in Texas, secured a position with Fiat in Turin based on the mechanical skills he had acquired in captivity. "In the strangest twist of fate," he wrote to his former camp commander, "my time as your prisoner provided me the expertise that feeds my family today. I now train others in the methods I learned in your camp workshops." The reintegration of former prisoners into Italian society was not without challenges. Some faced suspicion from neighbors who had suffered under German occupation, resentful that the prisoners had spent the most difficult war years in relative comfort and safety. Others encountered political scrutiny, particularly those who had enthusiastically joined the Italian service units and cooperated with American authorities. As the 1946 elections approached, with Italians choosing between monarchy and republic and then electing their first democratic parliament, former prisoners often found themselves navigating complex political waters. The emerging Cold War division between the Western Democratic Bloc and the Soviet Communist sphere created new pressures and allegiances. The Christian Democratic Party, which would dominate Italian politics for the next 4 decades, found many supporters among former POWs who had developed favorable impressions of American society. The Italian Communist Party, which emerged from the war with prestige from its resistance activities, viewed these Americanized veterans with some suspicion. This political dimension of the POW experience emerged in unexpected ways. In the town of Barletta in southern Italy, former prisoner Franco Esposito campaigned for local office by explicitly referencing his time in America. "I have seen what is possible when a society organizes itself around abundance rather than scarcity, or around opportunity rather than restrictions. The American system is not perfect, but it offers lessons we would be wise to consider as we build a new Italy." The Italian government's official position on returning POWs was complicated by international politics. While privately grateful that the prisoners had been well treated, publicly acknowledging positive American treatment risked appearing too pro-Western at a time when Italy's international position remained delicate. The government provided minimal recognition or support for returning prisoners, focusing instead on war damage compensation and economic reconstruction. This official ambivalence contrasted with the personal connections that endured between former prisoners and Americans they had encountered. Despite Cold War complications, correspondence flowed between former guards and prisoners, camp commanders, and their former charges. Christmas cards, family photos, and updates on post-war lives crossed the Atlantic in both directions. Some American companies even employed former prisoners as representatives in their expanding European operations, valuing their English language skills and familiarity with American business practices. Perhaps the most lasting legacy of the Italian POW experience in America was culinary. Prisoners who had worked in camp kitchens returned with modified recipes that incorporated American ingredients and techniques. The creative adaptations they had developed to approximate Italian cuisine with available American ingredients influenced regional cooking in subtle ways. Some returned with a taste for American foods they had encountered, from peanut butter to barbecue, that they introduced to their families. Sergio Bartolini, who had worked in the officers' mess at Camp Patrick Henry in Virginia, opened a small restaurant in Rimini after the war. His menu featured what he called Italo-American cuisine, traditional Italian dishes with modifications inspired by his time in America. In captivity, we had to improvise with what was available. he explained to a local newspaper in 1947. Now, I find these adaptations have a charm of their own, a fusion of traditions that represents my own journey through the war. By 1947, the last Italian prisoners had departed American soil, but the cultural, economic, and political influences of their unusual captivity continued to reverberate. As Italy rebuilt under the Marshall Plan, former prisoners who understood American systems and expectations often found themselves in advantageous positions, serving as bridges between Italian traditions and American modernization efforts. The number of Italians applying for visas to emigrate to the United States increased significantly in the post-war years, with former prisoners often among the applicants. Their familiarity with American society and positive experiences during captivity made the prospect of starting over in the United States less daunting. American immigration officials noted this trend, with one report observing former POWs constitute a disproportionate percentage of Italian visa applicants. Their references often include former camp commanders or guards, and they display unusually accurate knowledge of American geography and customs. Some of these emigration stories created full-circle journeys. Former prisoner Giuseppe Novelli returned to Arkansas in 1949, settling near the very camp where he had been held. He established a small farm implementing techniques he had learned during captivity, eventually becoming a naturalized citizen. At his citizenship ceremony in 1956, his former camp commander attended as an honored guest. "In war, I took his freedom," the commander told a local reporter. "In peace, I am proud to welcome him as a fellow citizen." The story of Italian POWs in America represents a unique historical paradox. Enemy soldiers who experienced America at its most abundant during its greatest military mobilization. Prisoners who enjoyed cultural accommodations while American civilians endured rationing. Captives who returned home with advantages derived from their captivity. The pasta and wine served in POW mess halls symbolized an approach to warfare that recognized cultural identity as a factor in human psychology and behavior, an early example of the hearts and minds concept that would become more explicit in later conflicts. The institutional memory of this experience influenced American approaches to subsequent prisoner-of-war situations, though never again would enemy prisoners be brought to the continental United States in such numbers. The recognition that humane treatment yielded practical benefits, reduced escape attempts, better work productivity, and potential post-war influence became part of American military doctrine. For Italy, the returning prisoners represented just one component of the complex post-war relationship with the United States. As Italy aligned firmly with the Western Bloc, accepted Marshall Plan aid, and eventually joined NATO, the first-hand knowledge of America possessed by thousands of former POWs contributed to the cultural and political bridges between the two nations. This influence operated at the grassroots level in thousands of families where a father or brother or son had returned with stories of America that contradicted both fascist propaganda and communist critiques. In village councils and town meetings, in businesses adapting to new economic realities, in cultural organizations navigating between tradition and modernization, the voices of those who had experienced America from within provided perspective not available from either political rhetoric or Hollywood films. The academic study of the Italian POW experience in America remained limited for decades, overshadowed by the larger narratives of World War II, the Holocaust, the major battles, the atomic bombings, the beginning of the Cold War. It was not until the 1980s, as former prisoners entered retirement and began recording their memoirs, that historians began systematically collecting and analyzing these accounts. Dr. Louis Kiefer, whose 1988 book, Italian Prisoners of War in America, Captives or Allies, represented the first comprehensive academic treatment of the subject, noted this historical neglect. We have here a significant wartime population transfer, over 50,000 men who spent years in America, that somehow slipped between the cracks of historical attention. Their story doesn't fit neatly into narratives of wartime heroism or suffering, Yet it reveals important dimensions of both American and Italian wartime experiences, the aging former prisoners interviewed by Kiefer, and subsequent. Historians often expressed similar sentiments about their captivity. Most acknowledged the ironic good fortune of their capture, which had removed them from the brutal Italian campaigns and the post-surrender German occupation. Many expressed genuine gratitude for their treatment, while also recognizing the complex psychological position of owing such gratitude to former enemies. Antonio Cervi, interviewed in Milan in 1986, summed up this complexity. "For years I felt guilty that I ate well while my family went hungry, that I was safe while childhood friends died fighting in the mountains. But time has given perspective. None of us chose this war. I was a farm boy conscripted to fight for a government I did not elect. That I found unexpected decency in America was not my failing but a quirk of fate. The pasta they served us, this small gesture of cultural respect, told us more about American values than any propaganda could have. The material evidence of the Italian POW experience in America has largely disappeared. Most of the camps were temporary facilities dismantled after the war or repurposed for other uses. A few buildings remain, repurposed as storage facilities or incorporated into other structures. The most enduring physical legacies are works created by the prisoners themselves, murals in churches, stone walls on college campuses, chapels built for worship, and infrastructure projects like irrigation systems on farms. At 15 Missoula, Montana, a museum now preserves the history of its wartime function as an internment and POW facility. In Hereford, Texas, a small memorial marks the location of the camp that once held thousands of Italians. But for the most part, this chapter of history exists now primarily in archives, in academic studies, and in the dwindling number of family stories passed down from those who experienced it firsthand. The story continues to resonate, however, because it represents a counter-narrative to the prevalent focus on the horrors of World War II. Without diminishing the very real suffering and atrocities that characterized much of the conflict, the experience of Italian POWs in America reminds us of the possibility of maintaining humanity even in the context of total war. The provision of pasta and wine to enemy prisoners represented not weakness, but a sophisticated understanding that cultural respect could serve strategic purposes, while also honoring fundamental human dignity. In the small town of Clarinda, Iowa, a remarkable reunion took place in 2002. Former prisoners, now elderly men in their 80s, returned to the site of the camp where they had been held. They were greeted by former guards, by children of the farmers they had worked for, and by community members curious about this nearly forgotten chapter of local history. Together, they shared a meal that included both Italian and American dishes, symbolizing the cultural exchange that had begun under the unlikely circumstances of wartime captivity. One of the returning Italians, Pippo Ginelli, offered a toast at this gathering to the strange workings of fate that made enemies into friends, that brought Mediterranean suns to the heart of America, that allowed some small humanity to flourish amid a world at war. We came as captives and departed having captured something of America in our hearts. Per la pace, for peace. As the last generation with direct memory of World War II passes from the scene, stories like that of Italian POWs in America risk fading from collective memory. Yet they offer valuable perspectives for contemporary issues of cultural integration, treatment of enemy combatants, and the complex humanity that exists beyond ideological divisions. The mess halls where Italian prisoners were served pasta and wine, a small accommodation to cultural identity in the midst of global conflict, represent an approach to warfare that recognized enemies not merely as threats to be contained, but as humans who would someday return to a world that needed to find peace. In the years following the war, some American communities where POW camps had been located discovered another lingering impact of the Italian presence. Seeds planted by prisoners, sometimes literally, had taken root in local culture. In Ogden, Utah, an annual Italian-American festival traces its origins to connections formed during the war years. In Massachusetts, descendants of former prisoners later immigrated to the region where their fathers or grandfathers had been held, creating new Italian-American communities with unique historical connections to the area. These cultural exchanges represented the unintended consequences of a wartime policy designed primarily for security and labor utilization. When American authorities decided to provide pasta and wine to Italian prisoners, they could not have anticipated the long-term ripple effects of this cultural accommodation, how it would influence not only the prisoners' experience, but also their later perspectives on America, their political alignments in post-war Italy, and ultimately the relationship between the two nations. The story of Italian POWs in America during World War II thus becomes more than a historical curiosity. It represents a case study in how policies based on cultural respect and basic humanity can yield strategic benefits that extend far beyond their immediate context. In a world that continues to grapple with conflict and its aftermath, with the treatment of enemy combatants, and with cultural differences in international relations, this historical episode offers both practical lessons and grounds for reflection. The pasta served on metal trays in POW mess halls across America, the measured cups of wine provided on Sundays, became not just food but symbols of recognition, acknowledgement that cultural identity persists even in captivity, that humanity continues even in war, and that respect can sometimes be the most effective weapon in the long-term battle for influence and understanding between nations.